You are listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding, combating stigma since 2021. I wanted there to be a podcast about hoarding disorder from somebody who hoarded rather than a professional. That didn't exist, so I created it. And that's this podcast that you're listening to now. Subscribe to the podcast and find my social media links, episode transcripts, and every link that I mention at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Finally, I am not a doctor. I'm just a hoarder doing her best. So do seek professional support if and when you need it. Hey, how are you? I am alright. We're getting bits of sunshine, which does my mental health the world of good.
Let's start with some housekeeping.
So, minor, tiny bit of housekeeping this week, and that is that the next Hoarding Accountability Zoom session, I think I finally learnt what order those words go in. The next Hoarding Accountability Zoom session is on Sunday. It would be amazing to see you if you wanted to come, or it would be amazing for you to be there. We don't have to actually see you. If you would like to come along, see how it works, this will be the third one, head to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/ticket and grab a ticket and I'll see you there. Get together with some other hoarders who know what you're going through and we can try and do some de-hoarding together. Okay, today I am talking about letting go of stuff that no longer serves you, but I'm not talking about stuff for once. Getting rid of stuff that no longer serves you may be a happy side effect of getting rid of the stuff I'm going to be talking about that no longer serves you. But I want to look at coping mechanisms that served a useful purpose and are now clipping your wings. Ages ago, I was with my therapist and I was talking about when I was self-harming a lot when I was younger. And for a long time, that was a big coping mechanism for me. And I was talking to my therapist about how it's not something I think to do so much now. It's not something I tend to do now, but that I'm not dismissive or annoyed at former me who did it quite prolifically. And I was talking about how it's something that served a purpose for a while and that I don't beat myself up for having done it. I don't beat myself up for having scars because I can honour that it served a purpose and that it's no longer needed. And so I honour it as having given me something that I needed. It may have been dysfunctional, it may have been maladaptive, all of those things. It may have been, really inherently self-destructive, but it gave me something that I wasn't able to get anywhere else. I can look back and honour it for having given me those things. I can honour that self-harm, messed up as it may sound, did what I needed it to do. And I no longer need it to do that. And so I can look back, honour it, and realise it's not something I tend to carry with me now. If you've heard me talk about how I stopped self-harming, you will know why I don't say I don't do it anymore, or why I don't say I've stopped doing it. For all intents and purposes I have, but I can't say that. It's complicated. So I was talking about that. I could honour what it gave me, I can honour what it did for me, and I can leave it in the past. And my therapist said one of those things that therapists have a tendency to do, which months later is still moving around my brain. still I'm sitting with it. I haven't been able to shake it, and that's because it was a really good point. She said, do you think you'll ever feel that way about hoarding? Do you think you will ever be able to say, okay, it is not the healthiest thing, it's kind of maladaptive, it's not socially acceptable, all of those same things are self-harming, but I can honour what it did for me because on some level it worked, otherwise I wouldn't have carried on doing it. I can honour that it gave me something I didn't feel I had any other way to get, and I can let it go. And the idea kind of horrified me, but that was because she was right that it's a very, very, very similar situation. And yet, my thoughts about my former self-harming self are quite generous and loving, and my thoughts to that messed up yet effective-ish coping mechanism are that it was messed up yet effective-ish, and so I can honour what it gave me. And yet when I look at current me, and when I look at hoarding, I am full of frustration with myself, anger with myself, anger with and frustration with this coping mechanism, annoyance that I haven't been able to shake it off, even though it's causing me problems. And I was not giving my current self and the coping mechanism of hoarding the same grace that I am able to give my past self and the coping mechanism of self-harm. And so even though that was a conversation I had with her months ago, it stuck in my brain. And over those months, I've thought of other things that I held on to for a really long time until I realised that the reason I started doing them was good, but then they stopped being useful. And so I've been able to let them go. And I've been able to look at those things and say, I needed that then, I don't need it now, it can go. So one example that I've thought of is that since my 20s until relatively recently, I had a rule that I could never take my nighttime medication before 10 p.m. And the reason I had this rule was that I spent quite a few years in a very deep depression where all I wanted once I'd woken up for the day was to be asleep again that night. I didn't want to be awake at all. And I knew that if I didn't have a firm boundary as to what time I could take my nighttime medication, then I would take it at 9, or I would take it at 8, or I would take it at 7. And it would get to the point where I'd be taking night meds at 3 p.m. just to be unconscious. And I recognised this in myself. And so I put in a rule that I take my night meds at 10 p.m, never before. And since my counsellor and I had that conversation, that was one of the things I realised, okay, that was a really useful rule to have. It was what I needed. It helped to protect me. But that's not the case anymore. And also I have to get up earlier these days than I did in those days. And I do find waking up quite hard. And so I wonder what would happen if I shifted my 10 o'clock rule to 9 o'clock. So I can take night meds anytime 9 or later, never before 9. I think I started by moving it to 9:30 and then to 9. And so for a few months, I now take them usually between 9 and 10. And it's lovely. It's really nice. And that's not because I'm in a deep depression and it means I can be unconscious earlier. It's because it helps me to get enough sleep when I have to get up for work in the morning. And so the 10 o'clock rule served me for ages. But now it makes more sense not to have that rule. And in fact, things have improved. Now I don't have that rule. So I can say, great, it's what I needed then. I need something different now. Another thing is around to-do lists. To-do lists are really important to me. I haven't given up on to-do lists. I think my brain would explode without them. But whenever I start something new and I'm quite insecure that I'm going to get it wrong, or I'm going to forget something, or I'm going to mess it up, something that helps is that I create to-do lists with every detail written on. So for this podcast, I had a weekly item on my to-do list that said plan episode. And I had a different weekly item that said record episode. And I had a different weekly item that said edit episode, and another that said transcribe episode, another that said upload episode to the website hosting, another that said add it to my website, and a final one that said share it on social media. And having all of those things listed reassured me that I wasn't going to forget anything important. I wasn't going to mess up. But then a month or two ago, I got to Friday and I published an episode, and I realised, I'm 143 episodes in now. So what I have been doing for at least 2 years is on a Friday, when I hit publish, I go to my to-do list website and automatically tick the entire week's to-do list items. So I hit publish, I go to Toodle-Do, which is the to-do list app I use, and I tick plan an episode, I tick record an episode, I tick edit, I tick transcribe, I tick upload, I tick all of those. And it suddenly struck me that I don't need every stage of that on my to-do list anymore. Because I know what I'm doing. Well, I may not know what I'm doing, but I know how to get an episode up on a Friday and what needs to be done around that. And so I changed my to-do list just to say podcast on a Friday. And then I thought, I've done nothing but podcast on a Friday for years now. I don't know if I even need that. But I've kept that one. I need a bit of insurance for my insecure self. But that made me review a lot of these recurring items on my to-do list. And it was full of these things where when I'd started something, I was worried I would skip an aspect of it, or I would miss something crucial, so I would write every step down on the to-do list. And like with the podcast, those things have been really useful. But now we're at a point where they were not only not serving me, but they were just creating a pain point every time I had to do it. Because instead of ticking off the thing, I would have to tick off my extensive list of tasks associated with the bigger task. And so again, I can honour how useful those extensive details were when I started the podcast or whatever regular task. And I can also say, and I don't need that anymore. What do I need now? I hope you're finding this episode useful. If you want the amazing feeling that comes with supporting something you truly appreciate, you can donate to support the podcast. If that's not possible at the moment, leaving a review and sharing the show with others who would benefit from it are also incredibly helpful. Every contribution, big or small, helps a lot. Find out more at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support. And we've all got loads of these things, and some of them are quite damaging to us, and some of them are quite neutral, or they're not damaging, but they're a bit of a pain, and everything in between. So for some people, a coping mechanism that served a purpose at one stage might be something like drinking too much or taking drugs that have a negative effect on you overall, but feel good in the moment. And I wonder if with those things and with hoarding, we can find a way to look at those things and say, maladaptive as that thing is, for whatever reason, my brain became convinced that that was what I needed. And for whatever reason, that thing kind of did the trick for us for a while. And so we became more convinced that it was what we needed. And I can thank it for having done that for me at that time in my life. But I'm now at a different time in my life. And actually that thing that was maybe helpful is now really suffocating me, or really exhausting me, or really limiting me, or really damaging my relationships. And maybe I can look at that thing and say, you did what I needed you to do. Thank you for that. But you can go now. I think a sign that a coping mechanism has switched from helping us cope to making things worse can be that it's causing us more stress or more misery or more annoyance or more disruption than it is causing us relief or ease or happiness. Or maybe it's getting in the way of things now. Maybe it's getting in the way of our work. Maybe it's getting in the way of our family relationships. Maybe it's getting in the way of our friendships. And also, I think the core thing with a lot of these things that have turned from helpful to negative are that whereas they start as a way of dealing with really difficult feelings, what they end up doing is stopping us from dealing with what's actually wrong. Because if we're constantly either drunk or hungover, or if we're constantly acquiring stuff or stressing about how we can't get rid of things or panicking because we've got a gas safety check, then that's a lot going on and we can't take a minute to work out what's actually up, what needs to be fixed for that to feel less necessary. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how we can spot those things that may have been useful at one point but are limiting us now, and look at how we can start to even entertain the idea of moving away from them without getting overwhelmed by the thing that we're kind of running away from in the first place. So I think Marie Kondo, her method certainly has some things that hoarders can learn from, but also has some things that I think would massively stress out or destabilize a lot of hoarders and wouldn't necessarily work in a hoarded home. However, I'm not talking about her decluttering methods so much as one quite small aspect of her approach, which is if you're getting rid of something, you can thank it for its service before you send it on its way. And we can definitely do that with stuff we're getting rid of, but we can also do it with ideas and thoughts and behaviours and feelings that we're trying to get rid of. So can we say to the hoarding, look, you felt protective at a time when I felt I needed to be protected. Thank you so much for giving me that feeling when nothing else was giving it to me. Thank you, but I think you can go now. Oh, it's really emotional even saying that, even saying it as a hypothetical thing on a podcast recording. Ooh, that was, thank it for what it gave us and set it free. And if that feels like several steps down the road and you don't quite know where you are yet, go back a step or two and identify those coping mechanisms you have in your life that are causing you more problems than they're solving. If you're listening to this, that might be either hoarding as a whole or some aspects of hoarding. Maybe letting hoarding go feels terrifying and wrong and inappropriate, but picking free stuff up from the side of the road might be something you could think about freeing from your life, or keeping one particular category of thing, or whatever it is. And it may be, like with my counsellor, that the things that applies to don't necessarily hit you straight away. It might be that after listening to this episode, you find yourself spotting those things in your daily life, like I did with my night meds, just because that idea had been planted in your head. So if you're searching your brain and thinking, nope, nothing like that, I'd say carry on listening anyway, because it might just be planting a seed. And I think with this process, it involves a lot of reassuring yourself, a lot of self-talk, reminding yourself that you're not leaving yourself naked and vulnerable. You're unlocking your shackles. You're not leaving yourself without. You're giving yourself space to stretch out. I have a friend who recently split up with a long-term partner, and, she's been going through all the things you would expect when somebody splits up with a long-term partner. And I saw her the other day, and she said, kind of almost confiding, it's so nice to sleep on my own and just stretch out in any position I want to. And that felt to me like her little flower unfurling a bit. The end of a relationship is hard and she's been going through it. But also she's feeling this new bit of freedom. She doesn't have to love every aspect of being dumped. Who would? But she's finding those little moments that are surprising her every time, where actually I might not have asked for this whole situation, but this one little aspect of it actually is pretty great. And if you approach it like that, reassuring, gently, not pressuring yourself to do it all at once, it's all about baby steps. Kind of feel as you go. You can test the waters. That was a lot of metaphors in one go, but you know what I mean. We know by now that hoarders are quite people of extremes, and there can be a temptation to go, I am no longer a hoarder, I am a minimalist. We don't have to do that. We can start by aiming for having 10% less than we have now and see how it goes, and stretch out in bed a bit. She's got that because she's sleeping on her own. We might get that because the pile of clothes that have been on the bed for 12 years is suddenly taking up less space. And it can be really useful to think in advance of some times you can call on when you're doubting yourself that demonstrate good experiences of letting the thing go. So that might be being able to stretch out of bed when you're trying to work out whether to get rid of something and you're doubting yourself. Have a little bank in your brain of, oh yeah, but it did feel great when I could stretch out in bed more. Did feel great when I could find an entire clean outfit without having to search in the bottom of bags. Do you know, it did feel really nice when I had enough surface space in the kitchen to be able to prepare a meal without having to move things out of the way. When you have those moments of, it's quite nice actually, try and make a mental note of them and access them when you need to, when you're hesitating, when you're questioning yourself. And also remind yourself, without self-recrimination, without yelling at yourself about it, but remind yourself of the problems that it's caused you and others around you. If you're trying to let hoarding go and you start to wonder whether it's worth it, you start to wonder whether you can gently go, yeah, but if I carry on in the more positive way, I won't have that situation where the bathroom flooded and I had to let somebody in and I was so mortified I wanted to never leave the house again. Remind yourself why your life can be better without this thing that is a millstone round your neck. And also, every time you achieve a little bit, let that power you on, because every time you achieve a little bit, that's proof that you can achieve this. When I stopped smoking, which was so hard, I never thought I could. But by the time I'd gone half a day without a cigarette, it was a Sunday, that first day, when it got to, I don't know, some point in the afternoon, and I really wanted a cigarette. And I thought for the millionth time, well, I'm not capable of quitting, so why am I not giving in already? And I would say to myself, well, yeah, but you didn't think you were capable of getting to mid-afternoon either, and you have. So maybe you can do more than you think you can. And maybe if you can get to mid-afternoon, you can do another 15 minutes without a cigarette. And so I did. And then it got to the evening, and I can't tell you how much I wanted a cigarette by then. But there was more evidence by then. Well, you didn't think you could do half a day, and now you've done 2/3 of a day. And so just because you think you can't never smoke again, you didn't think you could get to the evening without a cigarette, and you have, so maybe give it a bit longer. And that played itself again and again in my head for weeks and weeks and weeks. Well, you never thought you could do a full day, and you did. Well, you never thought you could do a week. You never would have believed it possible. And yet you did. So maybe you're capable of more than you think you are. So use every bit of progress to fuel the next bit. You don't have to think giant. I couldn't conceive of stopping smoking. Absolutely impossible. But I would let myself conceive of going another 10 minutes. And it's now been nearly 10 years. And I never had another cigarette. And I hope I never will. And if this is all feeling really impossible because you don't feel equipped, you don't feel confident that you can get what you need from anything other than hoarding, try to work out what it's giving you. What do you get from hoarding? And I'm not going to say you get nothing at all, because that's not true, or you wouldn't do it. So what's it giving you? Is being surrounded by stuff giving you comfort? Do you feel like you've got company if you're surrounded by things? Does the world feel safer if you're cocooned in stuff? Does it feel protective? Does it give you reassurance? What is it that you're getting from holding on to things and from acquiring things? Because if you can work out what you're getting from hoarding, you can start to think, okay, how else could I get that thing? If I feel like I get comfort from my stuff? What other things are there that are comforting? What do other people do when they want comfort? Or if I feel like I don't need to feel lonely because I'm surrounded by things, what could I do to tackle that loneliness? I've got a whole episode on loneliness that I will link to in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. If your stuff feels protective, what would feel protective that wasn't cocooning yourself in stuff? So if you can work out what you're getting from it, you can also start looking for positive coping mechanisms that aren't also hurting you at the same time, to see whether you can gradually do a bit more of the positive one and a bit less of the self-destructive one. And also, is it even effective at giving you those things? The more I tried to answer that previous question, what is it actually giving me? And I could answer it, the more I also realised that it might be kind of giving me those things, but not brilliantly effectively. I might feel safer cocooned in stuff, but objectively, is it giving me safety? No. And treat it very much as trial and error. You're trying stuff. I decided to try changing my night med time. It worked. Brilliant. Love it. If it hadn't worked, I could have moved it back to 10 o'clock. That would have been okay. And if you are gradually increasing your positive coping mechanisms while gradually decreasing the more harmful ones, you're not having to do a giant U-turn if you feel like it's not working. It's barely even a reversal. Be curious, as Dr. Jan Eppingstall would tell us to be. And I think with a lot of these things, ultimately, we have to maybe just try. Just try. Doesn't have to be all at once. It doesn't have to be a giant leap into the unknown. It starts by acknowledging, okay, I am looking for comfort in stuff. That's kind of weird. When I say it out loud, is there a better way to get comfort? Start exploring alternatives. Dip your toe in the water and see if you can get to a point where you can say to Hoarding, thank you so much, but you can go now. So my top tip this week comes from a lovely little podcast called Ariel and Ned's Daily Tips that may or may not help you. I like that kind of lack of commitment to their cause. It makes me laugh. And it's a daily podcast, only a minute or two long, with a daily tip. And this tip is called A Tip for Saving Money by Tricking Yourself. Have a listen.
90% of the small purchases you make are to get a tiny little hit of dopamine in your brain, having done a thing, right? And the purchase you make will not necessarily make you happy. So Nick's advice was this: check and see if you really want it by when you see a thing you want to buy, transfer exactly that much money from your checking account to your savings account and see if it hits the dopamine level.
Whoa.
And I'm bad at this tip, I want to be clear, but I did commit to this tip for like 6 months of my life a couple years ago, and I absolutely saved a lot of cash and ended up with a lot less crap in my life. So
Wow.
I recommend this tip wholeheartedly, but I will admit to not following it today in the year of our Lord 2024.
I mean, worth a try. Worth a try. So shout out to Ariel and Ned's daily top tips that may or may not help you. I will link to them in the show notes at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. Okay, thank you for listening, and I'll speak to you next time. Thank you for listening to That Hoarder Overcome Compulsive Hoarding podcast. It's been a pleasure to have you on board. You can find all the links I've mentioned and a transcript of the episode online at overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk. To find out more about how you can support this podcast and the overall project, go to overcomecompulsivehoarding.co.uk/support and do subscribe to the podcast so you make sure you don't miss any future episodes. There may be links in this podcast that earn me money. This doesn't come at any extra cost to you if you make a purchase through those links, and it helps to support the podcast.